All right. Back again, a second time here with a biography of Gordon H. Clark in last week or two. So trying to find some more time to continue moving on with this. And this is the first time that I've not done a complete chapter. So the last recording only got through half of chapter 6. And so now this is part 7 of this series, but only chapter 6 will be at the second half of chapter 6. And we now have the section on the controversy or the causes of it. And that, of course, is the Ordination Controversy. We saw last time that Gordon Clark was ordained despite some opposition, but that opposition was usually 10 or 11 folks, usually outnumbered in both the Presbytery and in the General Assembly of the OPC by big numbers. But that now the issues really will start coming up with the complaint that comes. And I noticed just now that in the book on page 85, I have the heading as causes of the complaint. And then when I go in to enumerate them, I call them causes of the controversy. So this is the kind of thing that kills you when you write a book and spend weeks or months editing it, and then you notice something years later. But hopefully the people will let that pass. So we'll start here on page 85 with the section on causes of the complaint and the controversy. The complaint, an attempt to block Clark's ordination in the OPC, was lodged both in opposition to Clark's theological views and in reaction to the Program for Action. The Program for Action sought to have Clark ordained, but it also encouraged the OPC to cooperate with other churches via an affiliation with the American Council of Christian Churches, to produce an official statement affirming the benefit of alcohol abstinence, and to establish church control over Westminster Theological Seminary and the Presbyterian Guardian. The WTS-led faction opposed each of these policies, and the occasion of Clark's ordination was their first opportunity to thwart its objectives. Rather than waiting for motions on these political topics to arise at the General Assembly, they decided to make their stand on Clark's ordination. The theological issues addressed, however, were so complex that many of the OPC pastors, not to mention lay people, struggled to follow the arguments. It is apparent that the causes of the complaint against Clark, however, were not solely the philosophical and theological doctrines it addressed, but also the ecclesiastical and political positions that Clark's ordination supported. A number of issues were included in the complaint, building a coalition for its support. Each of the charges in the complaint regarded theological issues Van Til had with Clark, which they had previously discussed in letters and in person. The issues were not isolated doctrinal points, but a series of related doctrines over which the theological systems of Van Til and Clark conflicted. That's important to recognize that it's systems, not so much points. I'm just noticing now I have my Wi-Fi. Oh, no, I do have it on the right one. Good. If I had it on the other church Wi-Fi, it might have dropped out. The fourth issue, however, on the free offer of the gospel, was not solely an issue raised by Van Til. It had strong support also from Ned Stonehouse and R.B. Kuiper, both of whom, like Van Til, had come from the Christian Reformed Church, where the doctrine was a hot-button issue. The intended results of the complaint, to declare Clark's ordination invalid and solidify control of the denomination and seminary, may have been enough to secure the support of any of the rest who signed the complaint, like Paul Woolley, who seems to have been more concerned about the political issues in the church than with Clark's theology. That the complainants were not concerned merely with Clark's theology, but with the political situation in the church is also shown in the fact that they questioned the procedure of Clark's ordination in the presbytery. If the authors of the complaint were opposed only to Clark's theological positions, in order to be consistent, they would have had to oppose other ordinations as well. Pointing this out, OPC missionary Henry W. Corey wrote to Van Til, "It has been suggested that a graduate named Mahaffey, which is Francis Mahaffey, who accepts Dr. Clark's apologetic, I understand, passed through Presbytery without any objections on the part of those who blocked Clark. This would seem to be an inconsistency if the case against Clark was on apologetic grounds. Clark was not the only figure in the OPC who had views at variance with the WTS faculty. There was a large diversity of views across the ministers of the young denomination, but these views were tolerated as long as they were kept sufficiently private. Clark's views, however, were visible to all due to his publicized resignation from Wheaton. A letter written just a few months after Clark's ordination reported how the Westminster faculty viewed Clark as a liability. This is a letter, do I even reference there? I think, okay, number 39 there. It's November 10, 1944. And this is a letter where neither an author nor a recipient is mentioned, so it's hard to know what's going on, but this provides some context. It says, Dr. N.B. Stonehouse came to Dr. Edmund to say in substance, you folks at Wheaton had a Clark problem. Now we at Westminster have that problem. The difficulties have arisen quite largely out of the move to have Dr. Clark ordained in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. We at Westminster have very high regard for Dr. Clark as a person and as a scholar, but we believe that his view of the gospel is out of focus. We believe in the presentation of the gospel and in evangelism. We understand that Dr. Clark's concept of the gospel message is purely an intellectual one, with emphasis on preaching and acceptance of substitutionary atonement. Because the faculty members at Westminster have felt constrained to take a stand against his position, which they believe to be an extreme form or even a distortion of Calvinism, the faculty is receiving criticism from Dr. Clark's friends, much as Wheaton did a year or two ago. The letter concludes, this material was given wholly spontaneously on Dr. Stonehouse's part in a very friendly and cordial spirit. Okay, so it is Stonehouse who said those things, purported, allegedly. Continuing. The program for action, specifically the desire of its authors to cooperate with other conservative groups like the ACCC, contributed to Paul Woolley joining the complaint against Clark. Woolley had written an article in the Presbyterian Guardian titled Discontent, just weeks after Clark had been ordained. In it, he identified two types of discontent in the church. He called one malignant and the other healthy. Woolley cited discontent over lack of numerical growth of the church, a malignant type, but concern for lack of enthusiasm over the Reformed faith as healthy discontent. He argued that the two goals were incompatible and that the denomination must therefore choose one of them. He wrote, the question is really a very simple one. Does the Orthodox Presbyterian Church want to have a growing revival of the preaching, teaching, and application of the biblical and Reformed faith in these United States in the year 1944? Or does the Orthodox Presbyterian Church want to have many members and much money and read about itself often in the newspapers? It can have either one, but it cannot have both. All right, that's the end of Woolley's quote there. So we'll come to the causes then of the controversy. I have 1, 2, 3, I believe it's 4 of them here. And then we'll get on to a couple other related subjects before this chapter is over. So the cause of the controversy, number one, and I think this one is chosen as number one because of its prominence. There's no doubt that this controversy is truly called the Clark-Van Til controversy. And so the number one cause of the controversy is Van Til's concerns about Clark's philosophy. Though there were ecclesiastical and political causes of the controversy, the central cause was that Cornelius Van Til had serious misgivings about the philosophy and theology of Gordon Clark. The earliest recorded reference to the theological issues between Clark and Van Til is a comment of Reverend Richard Weiler Gray in the Kelvin Forum. Referring back to the time of Clark's nomination of Machen as moderator of the General Assembly in 1936, Gray wrote, at that time, Clark's, differences with Cornelius Van Til were well known. as those who were students at Westminster Seminary at that time can testify. I think that's an interesting point. I've noted that before, that Clark and Van Til's disagreements go back, but it's interesting here that it says in 1936 that these differences were well known. So this wasn't even a private matter. The primary theological concern Van Til had with Clark regarded a doctrine called the creator-creature distinction. Van Til's understanding of this doctrine was at the core of his thinking. In his 1939 syllabus, Christian Apologetics, he stressed the creator-creature distinction, saying that man as a created entity is different from God and, quote, can never outgrow his creaturehood, unquote. Van Til believed the creator-creature distinction necessitated a qualitative difference between man's knowledge and God's knowledge. Van Til viewed Clark as opposing such a qualitative difference. Van Til thus regarded Clark's view as an insufficient account of the qualitative difference between God and man, which he believed led to a denial of the fundamental distinction between creator and creature. Van Til wrote in a letter to a minister in the OPC, quote, Clark has for a number of years maintained openly and vigorously a position which would do away with the creator-creature distinction, unquote. The reason Van Til took this position may have come from his interpretation of the implications of the doctrine of divine simplicity. Van Til may have concluded based on this doctrine that since God and his attributes are identical, if a man were to have any of God's knowledge, he would therefore also have God, or be God, an impossibility. Van Til believed that this theological difference between himself and Clark was sufficient reason to warrant the complaint. The political issues in the church may have been more important to other signers, but for Van Til, the primary issues were theological. He wrote to OPC Minister Ed Kellogg before the complaint to indicate the main points of difficulty with what he understood to be Clark's position. In the letter, Van Til concluded, "Let me say again how much I dislike having to oppose Clark. I am simply conscience-bound before God to do so." And later he wrote, Clark's position therefore involves the rejection of the Reformed concept of God's revelation to man and a reduction of it to Greek specifications. I shall oppose it with every ounce of strength God may be pleased to give me. Van Til also defended himself against suggestions that his motivations, and those of all the signers alike, were personal rather than theological. He wrote, "In the first place, I may say that I did not, and as far as I know, my colleagues on the faculty did not entertain any personal feelings against Dr. Clark. On the contrary, we have always had the highest respect for him and his work. He has no doubt been instrumental in bringing several men to the seminary. If we had been willing to follow policy, we would have kept silence." Van Til is to be credited with attempting to resolve the issues in person prior to the filing of the complaint. In a letter of April 16, 1944, 5 months previous, Van Til mentions a recent conversation he had with Clark about the primacy of the intellect and other topics which were later included in the complaint. Referring apparently to this same meeting, Van Til wrote in a letter of July 2, 1944, saying this, "Just before Presbyterian meeting of last spring, Clark and I spent about 2 hours together at my house. I tried, as several times before, to show him that his article on the primacy of the intellect failed to make the distinction between the creator and creature fundamental. He dismissed the whole matter. At Presbytery, I discussed his 3 articles, the one mentioned, the one on the question of predestination, and the one on miracles, showing how in each case they would involve the rejection of the doctrines of the historic Christian faith. Clark dismissed the whole thing with a wave of the hand." I wonder how literally true that is. As these specific theological issues Van Til brought up will be addressed more thoroughly in the following chapter, we shall move on to other causes of the controversy. Indeed, this gets sort of hairy into the philosophy, and so I try to cover that more in the later chapters. And glad I did. I think I've forgotten some of it. Okay. Cause of the controversy number 2. Whether to include other fundamentalists. The second of the 4 causes of the Clark-Van Til controversy was related to the OPC's stance toward fundamentalist churches. The OPC's membership growth had stagnated, and an expected exodus of conservatives out of the PCUSA never materialized. Despite the stagnation, Clark continued to hope for growth in the OPC through the addition of fundamentalist members and congregations transferring from other denominations. In 1942, he wrote, "I have maintained a hope that the OPC could lead a considerable section of the fundamentalists." And in an article titled "An Appeal to Fundamentalists," he encouraged like-minded Christians to come out of their faltering denominations and join the OPC. He was clear, however, to invite unity with fundamentalists only on the basis of following the doctrines of the original reformers, namely the whole Reformed faith, not simply the basic tenets of fundamentalism, which Clark likened to a house with a foundation but no roof. Clark's vision was that the OPC would lead the fundamentalists under the banner of the teachings of the Westminster Confession of Faith in their entirety. Whereas Paul Woolley, in his article Discontent, stated his belief that the goals of church growth and commitment to Reformed principles were mutually exclusive, Clark held that the two goals were compatible. As I hope everyone else does, I do. The WTS faction disagreed with Clark and his supporters over the inclusivity of membership in the church. If church membership grew to include fundamentalists who did not share the Westminster Seminary faction's particular views, that faction would lose its majority control in the denomination. As Woolley's article showed, the WTS faction preferred their perception of Reformed purity over numerical growth in the church. Edwin Ryan, chairman of the Board of Trustees at Westminster, did not support the majority position, the faction's position. He had pushed for and got a committee of 9 3 years earlier at the 8th General Assembly in 1941 for the stated purpose to, quote, study the relationship between the Orthodox Presbyterian Church to society in general and to other ecclesiastical bodies in particular, and to suggest, quote, ways and means whereby the message and methods of our church may be better implemented to meet the needs of this generation, unquote. Elected to the committee were 6 elders, including Ryan and Clark, who favored the committee's purpose, and 3 elders, including Van Til and Kuiper, who believed the committee's goals compromised the Reformed identity of the OPC. The next year, at the 9th General Assembly in 1942, the Committee of 9 gave a report of its findings and recommended that the General Assembly elect another Committee of 5 to study the matter of cooperation with evangelical churches. But a minority report presented by Van Til and Murray Forst Thompson concluded against such an additional committee. The minority report stated, quote, we believe that the committee, however laudable the purposes underlying its formation and actions, represents a most unfortunate concentration of power and will tend to disrupt and to impede the work of our church, unquote. That's kind of ironic. An unfortunate concentration of power, as if that wasn't happening at Westminster. In critique of the minority report's appraisal, Clark wrote to Edwin Ryan, since it was not an administrative committee and could merely report to the assembly, the charges made against it were preposterous, unquote. The Committee of 9 was ultimately disbanded, striking a blow to Clark's hopes for OPC cooperation with evangelicals. He wrote, the discontinuance of the Committee of 9 is quite a disappointment, unquote. He also wrote of his frustrations regarding the committee, saying, quote, this past year I was on the Committee of 9, and the 2 above, Van Til and Thompson, were merely obstructionists. Thompson objected to everything I proposed. I hardly believe there was a single matter on which he approved, and Van Til objected to nearly everything, unquote. All right, so that's the whether to include other fundamentalists, or as I sometimes slipped into calling them evangelicals, but somewhat similar terms. Okay, now cause of the controversy 3, and I mentioned in the last recording that this is, I think, somewhat more news, right? So everyone knows Clark Van Til, that first cause, and then the second cause has been written about by OPC historians. But this third cause is this continued friction over alcohol at the seminary. So I'll get into that. Cause number 3, Clarke's resolution for alcohol abstinence. Another cause of the controversy was Clarke's position on how the church should address alcohol use and abuse. The OPC in general, and Westminster Theological Seminary in particular, had long had an image problem with regard to alcohol. By today's standards, their level of alcohol acceptance would hardly be questioned. But in the first half of the 20th century, not far removed from the era of alcohol prohibition, a church which did not outright condemn alcohol was likely to be held in suspicion. Rumors had long plagued the OPC that the family of its late founder, J. Gresham Machen, had made their fortune in the manufacture of alcohol. These rumors are addressed in Machen's biography, written by Westminster professor Ned Stonehouse. And I have a long quote, almost a full page quoting Ned Stonehouse. I'll take a quick break here. Advertisement. My sponsor, the Coca-Cola company, sending me big dollars. So big quote here from Stonehouse. Such is the mischief caused by slanderous and malicious reports, and the perversity of men to believe the evil rather than the good, that throughout the rest of Machen's life, and indeed for many years afterwards, credence has been widely given outright falsehoods concerning his attitude toward intoxicating beverages. They sometimes took the form that he was a wet and even a drunkard. Most frequently, it was stated that the Machen money was made in the brewery business, and that he continued to depend on that source for his income. Such reports were in circulation in the far West in 1934, for example, and were being spread by one of the leading clergymen of the denomination, PCUSA, as a basic reason why Machen had to be opposed. Graduates of Westminster have frequently encountered such charges, and the present writer has been told by a number of persons that regardless of what he may say to the contrary, there was absolute proof of their veracity. Such charges were completely without foundation in fact. It is true that Machen did not consider the 18th Amendment as wise, but this was basically due to his political philosophy, with its antipathy to centralized government. And to make a comment there, this is one of the reasons I love Machen. He's like the earliest strong libertarian in the Reformed world. You gotta love him with his libertarians just tend to have smarter ways, I think, of saying, well, I'm opposed to alcohol, but I'm not going to make an amendment against it. Okay, continuing Stonehouse's quote on Machen. His family background was hardly prohibitionist, though the godly and exemplary character of the lives of his parents is beyond cavil. Nor was Machen committed himself to total abstinence as a principle. Unfortunately, commitment to the biblical principle of temperance or moderation, as distinguished from total abstinence, is identified by some persons as license, and no allowance is made for the possibility that the defender of Christian liberty may consistently refrain from the exercise of that liberty. As for the charges concerning the source of Machen's income, it can confidently be asserted that they were pure inventions. That's, I think, to the extent I have it. I wonder, I'm sure some people have done more research on this. I tend to, come to agree with Stonehouse here. It's interesting that he mentions that these accusations have been made and people are saying I can prove that it's true. I wonder if there was any connection anyhow in the Machen family. Maybe someone who's more of an expert on Machen than I am could figure out, well, where did those come from? Was it purely bad rumor, or was there somebody in the family that somehow lived next to a brewery or was, connected to it in some way? Okay. After Machen's death, so we're done with Stonehouse. Back to the regular text. After Machen's death, the denomination's public image with regard to alcohol worsened. At the Third General Assembly in 1937, the moderator disposed of a motion to, quote, refrain as a matter of expediency from indulging in the use of intoxicating beverages, without a vote. A protest was filed later in the same General Assembly, over the fact that the resolution was disposed. But it was to no avail. In response to this and other issues, a group of ministers left the denomination immediately after the General Assembly and formed the Bible Presbyterian Church. The Bible Presbyterians took a strong stance against alcohol and earned a reputation as a dry church. By comparison to the BPC, the OPC earned the undesirable reputation as a wet church. Well, I'm not sure if earned is the right term, but we'll keep going. The church's image as wet was partially unfairly based on the rumors surrounding Machen's family and the comparison to the dry BPC. But at Westminster Theological Seminary, the liberty to use alcohol was seen by some as license. The situation was so dire that prior to the split of the denomination, J. Oliver Buswell submitted to Machen an extensive critique of Westminster Seminary, highlighting the issue of alcohol abstinence, or the lack thereof. Clarke saw the acceptance of alcohol at Westminster as a further detriment to the image of the church. With such a stain on the church's image, the reality of Clarke's hope that the OPC could lead the fundamentalists, most of whom were teetotalers, waned. He believed that the fundamentalists would not join the OPC without the church adopting an official policy on abstinence from alcohol. Therefore, Clarke desired to commend, but not absolutely require, abstinence from alcoholic beverages to improve the image of the church and to remove a stumbling block to the fundamentalists looking to the OPC for leadership. Clarke wrote of the issue. In the present circumstances, our church faces a deplorable situation. Because of the General Assembly of 1937 did not make a complete pronouncement on the liquor question, the church has been called a wet church. Because of rumors of drinking by persons connected with Westminster, popularly identified with the OPC, students have chosen to go to other seminaries. Insofar as these rumors are true, the individuals concerned are responsible for placing a stumbling block in the path of prospective students. The attitude of the faculty and students of Westminster on this and similar matters is widely and plausibly interpreted as smugness and stubbornness. Well-authenticated cases can be produced of students making themselves unreasonably objectionable and bringing reproach upon the church. The matter of drinking alcoholic beverages seems to be at the center, or at least a prominent part of this attitude. The faculty of the seminary has been requested privately to remedy the situation, but the reply was completely unsatisfactory. Unless something unforeseen should happen, the only Presbyterian procedure remaining is to bring the matter before the assembly. That's quoting from this document of Clarke's on the resolution of total abstinence. Okay. Continuing on. Bringing the issue before the assembly was exactly what Clarke desired to do when he wrote a proposal for a denominational resolution on abstinence. The Westminster faculty who had signed the complaint held to a position of Christian liberty in the matter of alcohol use. Professor John Murray, for example, explained the seminary's position well in an article for the Westminster Theological Journal. He wrote, "The progress of knowledge, of faith, of edification, and of fellowship within the body of Christ is not to be secured by legislation that prohibits the strong from the exercise of their God-given privileges and liberties, whether this legislation be civil or ecclesiastical." We might use that same quote today in regard to mask wearing and other things. On the particular matter at hand, Murray commented in a letter to Ned Stonehouse, quote, "Dr. Clarke's minority report, which will no doubt be presented to the General Assembly in the form of a resolution, gives me grave concern," unquote. These professors who supported Christian liberty in writing were also known to indulge in beverages themselves. A number of them were known to smoke pipes, a common practice of those who were of Dutch heritage, and Murray, of Scottish heritage, smoked cigars and occasionally drank single malt whiskey. To the Westminster faculty and to many in the OPC, the issue of alcohol abstinence had already been dealt with at the Third General Assembly in 1937, which, by not voting on the issue, essentially affirmed their position on Christian liberty. Thus, Clark's resolution for abstinence would not find any support among the professors. Clark saw the level of alcohol acceptance at Westminster as a real problem. He wrote to Reverend Strong, quote, "And I must confess that, rightly or wrongly, I think the seminary men are woefully blind to the situation. Kuiper speaks of having a course introduced to take care of the matter. In my judgment, no course on ethics is needed for this matter. Unless the professors change their attitude, a course will be no good. And if they change their attitude, a course would not be necessary. But what hope is there of the professors changing their attitude? For this reason, I want to push the resolution. I have maintained a hope that the OPC could lead a considerable section of the fundamentalists. They need leadership, and it ought to fall to us. But to lead them, we must have their confidence. Well, you can continue the line of thought for yourself." Unquote. It's important to note that Clark's position on abstinence shifted over time, or at least became more nuanced. In 1936, he had written to Boswell saying, quote, "I have always supported the prohibition movement," unquote. And again to Boswell in 1938. "I want you to know that in 1934 or 35, I wanted to raise the liquor question in the independent board, because I knew that at least one member of the board was drinking. Griffiths persuaded me not to because it would result in such an explosion that the whole case would be injured," unquote. But by 1942, Clark, it seems, had changed his position when he wrote to 3 OPC ministers saying, quote, "I affirm my belief in the doctrine of Christian liberty. Spurgeon smoked, Luther drank beer, the stinking stuff, and with the statement prepared by the Committee of 9 on the matter, I am in complete agreement," unquote. By the time of his proposal in 1942, Clark sought to correct the alcohol image of the OPC without forming laws opposed to it. His resolution was not to create a law regarding abstinence in the church, but simply to commend abstinence as beneficial. Continuing the same letter to 3 OPC ministers, he wrote, quote, "I sympathize more than the seminary men imagine, I judge, with their unwillingness to make even an apparent concession to the Wheaton group, the perfectionists, the victorious life group, and that type of people. I know very well that my resolution would not change their attitude one bit toward us. The people whom the resolution is aimed at are the good, humble Christians, here and there, who have been deeply grieved at our mess. It is a fact that the students at Westminster, and perhaps the younger ministers, have said and done unjustifiable things. But people still, no doubt, always call us, as Bert Goddard so cautiously expressed it to me, unbending. And our men must be ready to take it on the chin. Guts are required. But I do believe that some of our number have voted unwisely, even taking into consideration either their youth, their more prominent position, or any and all considerations," unquote. Clark wrote a motion regarding abstinence from alcohol and brought it up at the meeting of the Committee of 9, the committee on which Westminster professors Cornelius Van Til and R.B. Kuiper were also members. The motion read as follows. Whereas false statements and malicious rumors have been published by irresponsible persons and have been spread to the detriment of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church by some who may be well-intentioned but ill-informed. And whereas the 9th commandment forbids all prejudicing of the truth, including our good name, and whereas the Apostle Paul, though not obliged by the law of God, voluntarily made a vow in order to silence slander, and the late and beloved J. Gresham Machen followed this procedure in abstaining from alcoholic beverages. And whereas the Scriptures give authority to the Church to make pronouncement on matters expedient, therefore be it resolved that the General Assembly do hereby denounce the efforts to besmirch the good name of the Church and commend total abstinence as expedient conduct in the propagation of the Reformed faith. Now that's just the motion. It doesn't get approved or even spoken of at the General Assembly, as we'll see. The faculty at Westminster, however, were unmoved by Clark's appeals. Paul Woolley wrote to Ned Stonehouse, saying this, quote, "You will be interested in knowing that Gordon Clark wrote a very cordial and friendly reply to my letter on behalf of the faculty. but indicated that the only real solution of the difficulty regarding alcoholic beverages, in his opinion, would be a letter from me stating that the members of the faculty do not use such beverages. I wrote a letter to the faculty, and while it was appreciated, there seemed to be no need for any further official reply, and we therefore agreed that I would write him a short, personal, and formal note. I did this, indicating that the chances of his receiving any such statement from me were exceedingly low, since I myself would consider such a statement as calculated to damage the maintenance of the principle for which we have so long fought, and stating that I consider that principle a very important one to emphasize in these days. Unquote. Stonehouse agreed, later writing to Woolley, I am pretty much upset by Gordon Clark's resolution, and even more so by the argument. He puts argument in quotes. Unquote. Despite opposition from the Westminster professors, Clark continued moving forward with his proposal. Woolley wrote to Stonehouse about a committee of 9 meeting. Quote, by a vote of 5-2, I think, Van Til and Thompson being the minority, it was decided to adopt in principle a resolution setting forth the general scriptural teaching on expediency and Christian liberty, the exact text to be worked over further. I believe John Murray has been revising Cliff Smith's original proposal. I understand that if any resolution at all is to be passed, this has some hope of being all right. Gordon Clark indicated that it would not, however, prevent his introducing his minority report. Unquote. Woolley again wrote to Stonehouse, quote, I understand that Gordon Clark predicts that his resolution will pass the General Assembly by a 2/3 majority, unquote. And Stonehouse replied, quote, I trust no one takes Clark's predictions seriously, unquote. I have made this somewhat laborious in quoting from them in a number of letters here to make sure that we see the actual words and not my interpretation. A number of OPC ministers recommended to Clark that he not present his resolution. Robert Strong wrote to him, now about your resolution, I still feel that it would be better not to present it. Might not a big row on the abstinence question do harm at this point? Clark responded to Strong. Clifford Smith wrote me an almost overpowering letter to get me to withdraw it, and maybe I shall have to, but it will be a bitter disappointment. And finally, Ned Stonehouse wrote to Clark objecting to the resolution and its argument. Stonehouse was strongly opposed to Clark's resolution. He wrote to Reverend Strong, my conviction is that it would be nothing short of tragic if this resolution or a similar one was passed, or even if it received any appreciable amount of support, unquote. His reasoning was that Clark's resolution and the argument made a, quote, fatal concession, unquote, to the modernist view that attacked the Protestant view that the church is, that, quote, the church is so bound to the scriptures that it may not make pronouncements not derived from them, unquote. Rather, Stonehouse argued that the, quote, contents of Clark's resolution are not derived from the Word of God, but he insists nevertheless that the church has the right to make such a pronouncement on the basis of its judgment as to its expediency, unquote. In Stonehouse's view, Clark was making the same type of mistake the PCUSA had made many times in its actions during the fundamentalist modernist controversy. In Stonehouse's letter to Clark, he wrote, quote, I am in fundamental disagreement with your approach to this problem. Although I deeply appreciate your high motive, it is my judgment that your approach is fundamentally unsound. The main thrust of my statement is to point out that, in my judgment, the appeal to Act 15 is not pertinent. I am concerned as you, I believe, to counteract malicious rumors, but I am persuaded that nothing of real worth can come out of the method that your resolution advocates. Unquote. E.J. Young, another professor there, was also opposed to Clark's motion. He wrote to Stonehouse, saying, no doubt you have heard fairly detailed reports of the General Assembly. Best of all, to my mind, is the fact that the Committee of 9 is now out of existence. This major victory, so it seems to me, was the great achievement of this assembly. Also, I am inclined to think that no total abstinence overture would ever be able to poll more than a few votes. Possibly I am somewhat too optimistic in that, unquote. Ultimately, Clark heeded the warnings and chose not to present his proposal to the General Assembly. According to a letter Strong wrote to Stonehouse, Strong had seen a copy of a letter Clark had written to Paul Woolley, which read, "Owing to the fear expressed by several of the pastors that an acrimonious opposition to the resolution I proposed as a minority report of the Committee of Nine would produce more dissension in local congregations than the resolution would produce good, I hereby regretfully withdraw it." Unquote. Even though Clark did not present his motion, his view on abstinence became known to the faculty at Westminster. Seeing that Clark was essentially calling out the faculty, calling out the leadership of Westminster with his view, and could potentially bring it back up at a later General Assembly, the Westminster faculty were alarmed. Without the resolution, Clark had to rely on the Committee of Nine to develop positive relationships with other church bodies. Clark wrote to Edwin Ryan, "On withdrawing my resolution, I wrote to all who had written to me urging them to support the Committee of Nine." Unquote. But the Committee of Nine was disbanded, leaving Clark and those supporting his policies with less say and directly causing the program for action to be written. I think this also shows an interesting thing with Clark's self, that he could back down from something. He saw the wisdom of not going forward with it. But it seems he was passionate for it. I know I've seen in other cases too, philosophical discussions where he will admit his opponent's wisdom or points, but not necessarily give up all hope. Most intellectuals, theologians, philosophers tend to be pretty stubborn. We're slow to pick up new ideas or change our mind. I think that can be a good thing, though. So, okay, we have some more in this chapter. Cause of the controversy number 4, seminary control and the denomination's theology. The last of the 4 cases of the controversy addressed in this chapter is that of control over Westminster Theological Seminary. At the time of the controversy, the professors at Westminster, whether siding with Clark or against, held complete control of the affairs of the school. They had neither a denomination overseeing them nor a president to direct them. Since its founding in 1929, Westminster had remained an independent institution, and the professors had full say in handling its affairs. The status quo of professorial leadership at the seminary was threatened by 2 issues directly related to Clark's ordination. First, Clark's motion to commend abstinence of alcohol, although never presented, was particularly aimed at the seminary and the drinking issues there. Second, the program for action called for denominational oversight of the seminary. The Westminster professors had good reason to be concerned about church control over the seminary. Nearly all of them had previously taught at Princeton Theological Seminary, where church control had led to the modernists' control of the Board of Trustees and the conservative professors' departure to form Westminster. Thus, the faculty at Westminster desired to choose for themselves who would be on the board. They chose mostly recent graduates of Westminster, who supported the faculty's positions. As a result of the experience at Princeton, Westminster had been administered by consensus at faculty meetings since its founding. History taught them that the seminaries are the heart of the denomination. A popular phrase in Christianity, "As the seminary goes, so goes the church," is quite fitting to this situation. This was the case in the PCUSA, where the seminaries were all liberal by the 1930s, long before the majority of the church members themselves followed suit. Westminster Theological Seminary, by remaining independent, sought to avoid any shift to modernism or to other views divergent from the professor's own. Clark expressed what he believed to be the dangers of independency in the years prior regarding missionary societies in the church. To fellow members of an OPC committee, Clark wrote, "An independent society is responsible to no one but itself and involves all the dangers of unpresbyterian independency." There can be little doubt that Clark extended the same concern to an independent seminary. While Clark's alcohol abstinence motion and the program for action threatened the seminary's status quo from the outside, Clark's theology threatened it from the inside. Westminster had struggled through the years to enroll enough students to remain financially sound. In its early years, the seminary often survived only because J. Gresham Machen was personally wealthy and could himself make up for the budgetary shortfalls. So when, with Clark's direction, students from Wheaton College started attending the seminary, it was of great financial help to the institution. But the students who had come from Wheaton also came versed in Clark's thought. The Westminster faculty had to do battle for the theological minds of the students, but many who had studied under Clark remained committed to his teachings. A prime example of this was Edward Carnell, who came to Westminster having been taught by Clark at Wheaton. And despite having professed that he learned more from Wheaton, or more from Van Til and the impressive faculty of the seminary than he had at Wheaton, nevertheless remained committed to the consistency criterion of Clark's apologetic method. This concerned Van Til, as shown in a letter a few years later, in which a disappointed Van Til wrote of Carnell's prize-winning book, An Introduction to Christian Apologetics, saying, "Have you seen the book by Carnell? It is Clark through and through," unquote. Clark's ordination brought with it the possibility that he could teach at the seminary or at the newly planned Reformed University, and even further impact the future of the denomination. Robert Rudolph wrote, "Dr. Van Til said that Clark was probably the most effective teacher he knew, and that therefore he was afraid of the great influence he would have on the students, and that Clark's effectiveness would do much harm, more so than most other men," unquote. A letter from one OPC pastor to another raised the concern, saying, quote, "Cross currents of emotional pressure are present in the presbytery, currents originating from men who would seek to use Clark as a spearhead about the seminary," unquote. It was clear to Ned Stonehouse that the force of those aligning against the seminary caused the complaint to be written in reaction. He wrote, quote, "The issue, to state it again, is whether we are in our approaches to be distinctly Presbyterian. The Clark case is only one aspect of that. Indeed, it would not have arisen, in my judgment, unless there had been the anti-seminary left-wing group," unquote. However, because the seminary power struggle was intertwined with the Clark case, Stonehouse had to point out that there was a case against Clark on its own merits, and that false accusations had flown in the direction of the professors. He wrote, quote, "Unless we had felt that there was something wrong in Dr. Clark's outlook, we would never have taken the step of challenging his qualifications. But what happened? Immediately, people's minds were poisoned with charges that we had personal animosity toward Dr. Clark, that we were afraid of him, and all sorts of false and unchristian statements of that kind," unquote. All right. Those are the four causes of the complaint. We got a few pages left in the chapter. We'll try to push it out here. We have next a section on the meaning of the complaint. Reverend Ed Kellogg warned Van Til of the repercussions of lodging the complaint. He wrote to Van Til, quote, "I also feel that if Clark does hold errors of sufficient magnitude to make him unfit for the ministry, that the commissioners to the assembly will expect you as a teacher and apologete to present the error in a very clear and understandable manner." Good luck, right? Getting Van Til to be clear. Continuing Kellogg's quote, "If you are not able to make the error very apparent and show from Scripture, the seriousness of it, I'm afraid your opposition may arouse a certain distrust. I do not want you to conclude from this last statement that I distrust you, for I certainly do not. But I do feel that perhaps at this point you have made a mistake," unquote. Although many of the differences between the Westminster faction and Clark were of political and ecclesiastical nature, with the complaint, the Westminster faction chose to make their stand on theological and philosophical grounds. Clark, an old school Presbyterian, was a strict subscriptionist to the Westminster Standards, but the complaint asked him to subscribe to Van Til's particular views. By the way, I have a whole lecture on that. It's called something like High, Low, and In Between. I gave at Reedy River Presbyterian Church a few years ago. You can find that on sermon audio, and that title is borrowed and modified, I think, from a Townes Van Zandt song. Okay. Not only did this go beyond the requirements for ordination, but Clarke believed that Van Til's views were novel and in error. Because of this, Clarke concluded, the complaint, this quote, the complaint would have denied ordination to both Hodge and Green and even Machen. Those are respected former Princeton professors. Surely he's referring to Charles Hodge, not A.A. Hodge or Caspar Wister Hodge. And then Green, there were a couple different Greens at Westminster or at Princeton. Could be either of them. And then, of course, Machen is the third. Okay, so the last section here, presuppositionalism and the abandonment of old Princeton. A disagreement in apologetics between B.B. Warfield and Abraham Kuiper, a generation prior, sheds light on the origins of the Clarke-Van Til controversy. Warfield followed a long line of Princeton professors in his apologetic approach. In fact, the Princeton approach itself was a continuation of Scottish common sense realism philosophy, traceable to the 18th century. Warfield, like his precursors, held an evidentialist view of apologetics that appealed to general revelation to provide one with the knowledge of God's existence, prior to building a case for accepting the validity of the Bible. He believed the existence of God was knowable through the evidence of general revelation, through what was seen in the world, and by this, man was made inexcusable before God. Warfield also believed that by logic, the rules of logical inference, the consistency of the believer and the inconsistency of the unbeliever could be shown. Where Warfield had an evidentialist approach to apologetics, Kuiper had a presuppositional or proto-presuppositional one. Rather than starting with general revelation, Kuiper began with special revelation, the scriptures. He believed reason should not judge revelation. Kuiper saw the believers' and unbelievers' worldviews as completely separate, with no point of common ground. For Kuiper, all beliefs were relative to one's worldview. There was no neutral item on which the worldviews could agree. The disagreement between Warfield and Kuiper comes into view in the introduction to Francis Beattie's Apologetics, where Warfield called Kuiper, quote, a striking instance, unquote, of those mystics who have the tendency to, quote, deprecate apologetics because they feel no need of reasons to ground a faith which they are sure they have received immediately from God, unquote. Warfield then argued that in the face of rationalist attacks against Christianity, believers need better arguments for faith, rather than a retreat in the form of saying faith is a, quote, immediate creation of the Holy Spirit in a man's heart, unquote. Clarifying his own position, Warfield wrote, it is just as essential that grounds of faith should be present to the mind as that the giver of faith should act creatively upon the heart, unquote. And, quote, that faith is, in all its exercises alike, a form of conviction and is necessarily grounded on evidence, unquote. In short, Warfield saw Kuiper's approach, lacking arguments for faith, as purely fideistic. Cornelius Van Til, according to Owen Anderson in his book B.B. Warfield and Right Reason, quote, attempted to formulate a third position that takes the best of both of these, and yet avoids what he saw as weaknesses in each, unquote. Some, however, like R.C. Sproul, accuse Van Til of being fully a Kuiperian in his Sproul's Classical Apologetics. Other students of Van Til, such as Greg Bahnsen, denied this and pointed to explicit statements by Van Til to the contrary. W. Robert Godfrey, another student of Van Til, however, lends credence to Sproul's view that Van Til was far closer to Kuiper than to Warfield. Godfrey wrote, Van Til maintained the strong anti-modernism and unmodified Calvinism of old Princeton, but he did decisively change the apologetic direction of the seminary. He built not on the evidentialism of Warfield, but on the work of Abraham Kuiper. That is just hugely important to understand this unchanging, supposedly unchanging Princeton tradition. Now at Westminster, here's Godfrey saying the apologetics did change with Van Til, and he built it not on the evidentialism of Warfield, but on the work of Kuiper. And while perhaps even Van Til, but certainly his followers do mention both Warfield and Kuiper. I think I agree with Godfrey that Van Til uses Kuiper a lot more than Warfield. In fact, this has become the common view. Evidencing this, Greenville Presbyterian Theological Seminary professor Morton H. Smith has written, quote, "The apologetics of Dr. Van Til has come to be known as presuppositional apologetics, as opposed to the traditional evidential apologetics of Old Princeton," unquote. So Morton Smith sees Van Til as something new. It is a break in continuity with Old Princeton. Van Til's acceptance of Kuiper's apologetic over Warfield's effectively ended the continuance of the tradition passed down through the Princeton theologians, from Charles Hodge to A. A. Hodge to B. B. Warfield to J. Gresham Machen. Even Van Til's strongly supportive biographer, William White, admitted to the significance of the change from Old Princeton to Van Tilian apologetics. He wrote, "Throughout the last hectic months at Princeton and the early segment of seminary life in Philadelphia, it is not clear how many of the Westminster men were aware of the basic and far-reaching revolution going on in the orbit of apologetics. Did Machen understand how far from the old Princeton apologetic the new Westminster apologetic really was? Did Machen realize that Van Til, R.B. Kuiper, and Ned Stonehouse had brought to Philadelphia the best of Amsterdam?" Quote, unquote. In Van Til's own work, The Defense of the Faith, he confirmed, quote, "What has been advocated in this syllabus has in large measure been prepared under the influence of Kuiper," unquote, and argued that, quote, "It is only in apologetics Warfield wanted to operate in neutral territory with the unbeliever. He thought this was the only way to show the unbeliever that theism and Christianity are objectively true," unquote. But on one point, the usefulness of reasoning with unbelievers, Van Til sided with Warfield. He wrote, quote, "I am unable to follow Kuiper on the uselessness of reasoning with the natural man," unquote. And, quote, "Warfield was quite right in maintaining that Christianity is objectively defensible, and the natural man has the ability to understand intellectually, though not spiritually, the challenge presented to him. And no challenge is presented to him unless it is shown him that on his principle he would destroy all truth and meaning," unquote. Clarke believed that Van Til's and Kuiper's apologetic went too far in rejecting logic as a common ground between the believer and unbeliever. Despite Van Til's desire to avoid the use of logic to determine his worldview, he still had to employ logic. Clarke, realizing the impossibility and hypocrisy of such a position, retained logic in his apologetics, while Van Til denied common ground of any sort, including logic. Clarke argued that all men, believer and unbeliever alike, shared the same logical mental structure, because this structure was part of the image of God in which all men were created. In this respect, Clarke continued part of the tradition of Warfield and Old Princeton, even if he rejected other aspects, such as the thesis that general revelation necessarily preceded special revelation of the Bible. Explaining Clarke's view, Dr. Gary Crampton wrote in his book, The Scripturalism of Gordon H. Clarke, quote, "After demonstrating the internal incoherence of non-Christian views, the biblical apologete will argue for the truth and logical consistency of the Scriptures and the Christian worldview revealed therein. He will show how Christianity is self-consistent, how it gives us a coherent understanding of the world. It answers questions and solves problems that other worldviews cannot. This method is not to be considered as a proof for the existence of God or the truth of Scripture, but as a proof that the non-Christian view is false. It shows that intelligibility can only be maintained by viewing all things as dependent on the God of Scripture, who is truth itself. This is the proper presuppositional approach to apologetics," unquote. Clarke believed that because of the shared logical nature of all men, Christians can legitimately argue with unbelievers on two grounds. Firstly, the Christian can argue that the unbeliever's worldview is inconsistent, and secondly, The Christian can argue that Christianity is consistent. Van Til diverged from the old Princeton tradition further than Clarke by largely accepting Kuiper's formulations. Clarke later pointed out that, in fact, Van Til was outside of the Princeton tradition. He wrote, quote, Machen was more opposed to the Van Til apologetics than I am. Machen accepted Hodge, unquote. That's really a fascinating quote. It doesn't sound like Clarke had gotten that from the exact words of Machen. Oh, Machen was opposed to Van Til, but Clarke is making that deduction from the fact that Machen accepted Hodge. So what that relationship between Machen and Van Til would have looked like is an interesting question. I think some have written on, but there's not tons of material, as Machen was very busy with church affairs and not into the philosophy as his profession as much as Van Til and Clarke. Clarke, however, did not continue in the old Princeton tradition either, and admitted such. He wrote, quote, I never followed the old Princeton apologetic. I certainly never had any sympathy with the common sense school, unquote. In another place, Clarke criticized Scottish common sense as, and this is just the greatest quote, one of the most incompetent types of philosophy in the history of the subject. So Clarke is not a fan of the common sense realism philosophy. With neither party legitimately able to claim that they followed the old Princeton apologetics, the Clarke-Van Til controversy functioned to determine the new orthodoxy in the church's apologetics. It's very strange that we have such a divergence, that two new systems of thought develop around the same time. And the old system is somewhat done away with, although you certainly see it existing in the minds of certain thinkers that still advocate it to this day. All right, one final bit here. We're over an hour, and we'll call it good after this. Westminster Theological Seminary might have been friendly to Clarke's ideas in an earlier age. Princeton graduates from past generations would have appreciated his rigorous method, his uncompromising stance, his intellectualism, and his commitment to logical argumentation. But by 1944, the year of the complaint, much of this had changed. Westminster had lost many of its ties to old Princeton. When Machen formed Westminster in 1929, a number of the professors left Princeton to join the new seminary. But by the time of the complaint, all of the Westminster professors who had significant experience at Princeton were gone. Robert Dick Wilson, an expert scholar on biblical languages, had died in 1930. The independently wealthy Oswald T. Ellis resigned in 1935 to focus on his writing. And Machen had died in 1937. These three had been longtime Princeton professors, steeped in Princeton theology. With the departure of these professors, Westminster was no longer old Princeton. It was a new seminary with new professors, mostly young and with lesser ties to Princeton. The younger professors at Westminster, Van Til, Stonehouse, Kuiper, and Woolley, had all been students at Princeton, but only Van Til had taught there, and even then only briefly. John Murray had also taught at Princeton, but for only 1 year. The influence from old Princeton remained, but it was mixed with and muted by other theologies, particularly those of the Christian Reformed Church, in which Van Til, Kuiper, and Stonehouse had been raised. Influenced by the Dutch Reformed traditions, the Westminster faculty had difficulty recognizing the fidelity to the Presbyterian tradition in Clarke's theology. So that's where the chapter ends. So the changes at Westminster very much confuse things. And I mentioned there the Dutch Reformed influence, and we'll see that later as well, especially from the Christian Reformed Church with Van Til, Stonehouse, Kuiper, and Kuiper really more than the others involved there in the CRC. I didn't mention much there or anything really about John Murray coming from Scotland, and you perhaps see a different set of views there, which I'm not particularly knowledgeable about, except that Kuiper advocates, or not Kuiper, Murray, John Murray from Scotland, advocates exclusive psalmody, And I know a couple of the guys in the Presbyterian Reformed Church. This small group of churches emerged out of sort of the OPC with Murray, and then with some other folks. The names are escaping me. To mostly focus on exclusive psalmody. I'd like to hear more about their origins and about that church group. But it shows you the mixture of things going on. There's that old Princeton tradition, but there's the Dutchman coming in, the Scottish coming in, and certainly what Gordon Clark is doing and saying isn't all traditional either. Clark is really, I think, breaking new ground in some ways. But this is the fascinating thing about Clark's thought, is he's breaking new ground, but it's just remarkably simple. This idea, which has captivated me for more than 10 years, this idea of sola scriptura, but to a greater extent, the axiom of all knowledge being scripture. And that is what I believe shows promise for a more truly Christian philosophy, in which I hope to maybe write on someday, but it's a fairly complicated subject. But I think we'll call it good there, and we'll get to another video maybe in a few weeks. We'll see. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to say, but thank you all for listening to over an hour of history and philosophy. God bless.